Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is Chapter 3 in a fantastic series by WolfInSpace. As ever, please do let us know down below in the comments what you thought. Please do like and share, it really does help build the channel and our community further. And of course, don't forget to hashtag Team Fear. If you're not aware already, the show is now available for download on multiple platforms such as Podbean, Pod Addict, Spotify, iTunes, and many more. There's a link for those in the description box below, of course, and I will be uploading brand new fresh content to those platforms over the next few weeks that will be exclusive to those outlets, and of course that allows you to download the show and take it with you wherever you are. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled The Creatures of the Night, The Beast Within, Chapter 3. Let's get straight into that. 25th of September, 2019. The body of a 22-year-old girl was found, naked and with her head smashed in with a rock by the side of a stream some miles outside Bollington, Cheshire, United Kingdom. Her wallet was also taken, but her credit cards and phone had been left behind. Police could not find a verdict, but many believed that Piper Rosenthal, a girl that had been previously thought to be dead, had popped up at a train station the day before, was responsible. These reasons came from the fact that the bare footprints were found leading towards the body, and bloody handprints were found on the underside of the rock used to kill the female. A day later, Charlie Lancaster woke up at his desk. He had a small pile of police reports being used as a pillow, and his black trench coat lay over his chair. A cold coffee lay untouched on the coaster. Charlie groaned. His neck ached from sleeping in a jaunty position, and he looked at his watch. 6:53 a.m. He sighed and rubbed his eyes. He'd been working overtime these past few days, ever since the couple were brutally murdered on the last full moon. His close friend, Oliver Hassan, was locked in shock, and the primary culprit, Danny Adams, was locked in police custody. The door at the end of his small office opened, and Sergeant James Clark appeared. "Morning," Charlie grunted. He kept his defected eye on the sergeant. James settled himself onto the chair on the other side of the desk. "I've been on the phone with Inspector Hawthorne. You know, the bloke up in Glasgow. And he says they checked all the CCTV at the station for the 24th. And they interviewed all the ticket inspectors for the train from Chester. And they came to a conclusion." James had a hint of excitement in his voice. He handed Charlie a document filled with interview papers. "They couldn't find Piper. She never showed up in Glasgow. We think that the farmers in the Highlands were lying about their cattle being slaughtered for media attention." Charlie's heart leapt. If Piper wasn't in Scotland, then he was still authorised to find her. He stood up. "Tell the boys in Northumbria to check the cameras in every station on that route." He picked up his coat and coffee. "Where are you going?" James asked. "I'm going to go talk to Danny Adams," Charlie replied before he left his office, leaving James alone. Charlie reached West Hampstead Police Station at 8 a.m. He took the front desk by surprise, but was able to ask for interview with Danny Adams. He was escorted to Danny's cell and entered alone. He had brought a small amount of recording equipment and was hoping to interview Danny again. Unlike the last time, Danny was more cooperative. Charlie sat down and pressed the record button. "I apologise for your arrest, but you must remember that you are the prime suspect," he started. "But I haven't killed Piper, or attacked her, or anything," Danny groaned. He jolted his head across the room and sighed. "Well, I know you haven't killed her, but I have a reason to believe she is heading to London." Charlie flipped through a few of the papers he had brought with him and pointed to the interview sheets. "Why? Why would she come down to her?" Danny asked, in seeming fear. Charlie chuckled. "Lumidia Catalini said that the last thing you said to her in the flesh was that you lived in London," he said. Danny raised an eyebrow. "Piper was seen boarding a train to Glasgow, but got off before reaching there," Charlie added. "So you think she's coming to London?" Danny finally spoke up. Charlie cracked his knuckles. "Think about it. Who do you think she hates the most out of everyone?" And Danny shrugged. Me? Exactly. And she knows where you live, not to mention that it's been plastered all over the news where you are now. Danny shuddered and put his face in his hands. So she's after me? He mumbled. Yes. Well, what do you expect me to do? What? What are you going to do? Charlie put the papers back into his folder. I'm working on it, Mr. Adams. Danny suddenly grabbed the detective's hand. But you don't know what she's capable of. If you think she threw her mother across the yard, that girl was too powerful. I'm working on it. Charlie shook off Danny's sweaty palm. He pressed the button of the recording machine and turned it off. Have you had time with your solicitor? Charlie asked. Danny looked at him. Yes. Charlie smiled. I hope you realize, just because we're cooperating to find your fuck buddy, I'm still getting you convicted. Charlie scoffed and left the room. Charlie felt slightly good about himself as he left the police station. He had successfully told Danny about Piper and had refreshed his own memory of events. He lit a cigarette after leaving the building and took a few puffs at it as he began walking down the street towards the bus stop, when he heard a quick footstep coming up from behind him. It was James. He looked out of breath and he was panting. He had a few pieces of paper in his hands and he was frantically pushing them towards the detective. The boys found something. Charlie, they found her. In Manchester. Oh, Piccadilly, James hoarsely said. Charlie looked over the papers. The first showed a crowd coming from the train, heading through the ticket checkers. A face in the crowd was circled, and Charlie focused in on it. It was unmistakably Piper's, but she was wearing an eerily calm and happy face. The tracksuit she was wearing was identical to the one the girl who was murdered was wearing. Charlie took a hard puff on a cigarette and spat into a bin. He coughed a few times as he hadn't been smoking for long when he snatched the papers from the sergeant. He grabbed his friend's radio. It's D.I. Lancaster. Get a squad to Manchester Piccadilly, quickly. Of course. I want you to tell me if anything happens. Well, text them then. For God's sake, this is bloody urgent. I don't care if this is in Cheshire's jurisdiction. Just call them up. Fine then. Pick me up. Charlie handed James the radio back. A mother and a child who were also at the bus stop looked nervously at Charlie. A Metropolitan police car on patrol showed up. The officer driving noticed them and beckoned them in. The two police officers got into the car and Charlie ordered the driver to take them to HQ. Charlie explained the situation and frantically dashed out of the car when they turned up at Scotland Yard. Charlie tripped over his coat before staggering through the entrance. He raced through reception and ran flight after flight of stairs and knocked on the door of the chief inspector. C.I. David Miller answered the door. Detective Lancaster? He asked. Sir, they found her. They found Piper Rosenthal in Manchester, Charlie panted gruffly. Detective Lancaster, come, take a seat, then explain it to me. Miller welcomed Charlie in and closed the door behind him. Charlie, Miller set out a chair for the detective, and Charlie took it. Sir, they found her, he panted. Miller looked at him. I know, but my question is, how would you expect the Cheshire lot to listen to us? And Charlie looked at his superior, his defected eye working like a somewhat cybernetic organ. Because Sergeant Oliver Hassan works up there. He was there at the massacre. He took the photograph of whatever was in there. He knows me. He sounded calm. Miller turned his back and faced his window. I remember when you first came into this room. A mere constable, a 19-year-old boy who wanted to make his mark on the world. Charlie looked intently at the senior officer. Sir, I want to send the squad to find Piper in Manchester. He spoke up. Interrupting Miller's monologue, Miller turned around and looked at him. Why do you think we should do that? Charlie scoffed at the question. To apprehend her. We need her to provide evidence of Adam's trial. Come off it, Charlie. You can't seriously think that you have any evidence to get that boy convicted. Miller creased a smile. As I was saying, sir, Piper is also viable for criminal charge. The detective breathed. Miller placed his fist on the desk. And you think that whatever Sergeant Hassan found in that room was Piper? He looked coldly into Charlie's eyes. Charlie combed through the folder he had in his hand. He produced both the image of the creature in the bedroom, which the couple had been murdered in, and a photograph of Piper. He showed them to Miller. Look at the similarities, he said. Miller stared at the images and pointed his fingers at only the similarity he could notice. All they have in common is black hair. He looked at Charlie. But take into account that this was close to where Piper was last seen, and Piper was reported to have entered the property, and the blood the team found was hers, and the boys in CSI found teeth belonging to her in the downstairs lounge. I am well aware of the CSI report, Charlie, but it's ludicrous to think that that girl is that thing. Miller slid the pictures back to the detective. Just talk to Manchester. Get them to send a squad to find her. Charlie sighed. Miller sat down. Very well, Charlie, but remember, if you cock this up, if this is a big misunderstanding, you can count on facing a tribunal. Miller picked up the phone on his desk. Go home. Get some rest. You may need it for the results. Charlie nodded. Thank you, sir. And he left the room, a triumphant spell of glee ripping through him. Now she didn't know where she was going, and she needed to get to London. That was where Danny was, and she needed help. She was what she was. Lost. That's what Danny said she was, and she rolled her tongue around her mouth. There was still a little bit of blood there, but it was getting old. She would need some more soon. It was awfully crowded. Why was everyone giving her that strange look? Hang on. There was a newspaper next to her, and she read the front cover. Search for missing girl continues. Wait. That was her face. That was her. That was... Wait. No. She needed to get out of here. That's right. One step after another. Forward. And she was going into the alley. Then no one could see her. So many faces looking at her. She didn't like it. Wait. Someone was calling her name. A male voice. A man. Why was he calling her name? Piper Rosenthal? Was that her name? Maybe they would forget about her if she disappeared. She would walk into the alleyway, and there we go. Into the alley. Now she could turn around and see. Some police officers. Why were police officers looking for her? Oh, now she remembered. She had killed that girl. Well, maybe she'd killed someone, but she'd killed many people. She hardly thought a young adult would matter. But now what? The two officers were looking at her, approaching her with looks of disgust. Hang on. Was she being arrested? Her mouth was speaking now. I haven't done anything. That was all right, good girl. Play it cool. But it wasn't working. They were closer now, and they were taller than her. They were arresting her now? Yes. They were putting her hands in cuffs. No, this wasn't going to happen so easily. She grabbed one of the officers by the throat, her cuffed hand grabbing his fist, preventing him from fighting back. And there we are. She grabbed tighter and tighter, and then she felt herself crick, and he fell to the ground, dead. How sudden, how amusing. She was feeling something in her stomach, moving throughout her body, before she began to laugh. How funny that a strong, tough officer could be killed by a mere weakling. She was feeling something more than that, though, and hummed in a sadistic tone. The other officer struck her with a baton. Ow! That hurt. She couldn't allow such a dangerous individual to mill around on these streets. The officer went in to strike again, but she was ready. She grabbed the hard material tightly and broke it in half. And she was feeling even more, well, what was the word? Happy? She gripped the officer's wrist tightly and twisted it completely around, silencing her screams and feeling her bones break under the pressure. She was suddenly feeling hot. Was she nervous? No, this wasn't nerves. She anchored her foot on the officer's boot, and she was too hot. The officer struggled, but realized it was pointless and stopped resisting as she grabbed her neck and twisted it to such an extent that she was amazed it hadn't snapped. But it did. As she sat down next to the two bodies, her stomach rumbled, and she realized she hadn't eaten for a while. But she couldn't eat humans like this. She'd feel sick. She needed to transform before she could eat humans. The girl pondered, and she was hungry though. By God, she was starving. Charlie shut his eyes open. His phone was ringing, blaring louder than it should have been. And Charlie sat up in his bed and reached over to his bedside table. His fiancée, Abigail, batted a hand over to him to try and get him to lie back down. He threw her off. He picked up his vibrating phone and blinked a few times. It was James. He answered the call and put the phone to his ear. "What is it? Did they catch her?" he asked. There was heavy breathing on the other end. "The 2 officers that went to stop her are dead," James replied shakily. Charlie gasped. "Dead? Dead? You're not serious?" Charlie asked. "I can't describe it over the line. Get to HQ now." James ended the call, leaving only a flat line of static. Charlie got up out of his bed and checked his watch. 4:18 a.m. Charlie groaned and awkwardly got dressed. He picked up his coat and poured himself a coffee, and he sat down at his dinner table and drank it while reflecting on the news. There must have been some mistake. The 2 officers sent to detain Piper. He couldn't be dead. Charlie looked at his brown liquid in his mug. He took a sip and then downed the entire beverage. He left his house and got in his car and headed into the city centre. There was a hubbub in the station, to say the least. Charlie felt almost alienated as he walked through the small groups of people milling around. James found him and took his wrist. "Through here," he told him. Charlie was taken to a small auditorium where a forensics team was sat with a few other officers Charlie didn't recognise. James bussed him into a chair and plopped him down next to him. One of the officers Charlie didn't recognise was sat next to him. He was a thin man with an obvious Arabic descent. He had well-kept black hair and dark brown eyes. "Fancy seeing you here again." It was Oliver Hassan, the sergeant Charlie had originally interviewed Danny Adams with. "What's the news?" Charlie replied. 2 officers went to find Piper. They didn't report back. We got a call at midnight saying that some students found the bodies. Hassan was cut off as a serious-looking woman walked into the room. Again, Charlie didn't recognise her. The room stood. The woman walked up to a stand and ordered for the lights to be dimmed. "Keep your seats," she said. The room sat down. "I am forensic psychologist Dr. Ingrid North. Now, you'll know why I am here." She pressed a button on what looked like a projector controller, and a picture appeared on the screen behind her. It was Piper. "Miss Piper Rosenthal disappeared in August. She was then seen yesterday in Manchester. 2 officers, Sergeant Thomas Davis and Sergeant Eliza Woodworth, were sent to intervene and detain her. Unfortunately, they did not respond to radio calls an hour later, and an hour after that a call was made saying that 2 bodies had been found in an alleyway." Dr. North pressed the controller again, and another image appeared on the screen. To say that shock hit the room was an understatement. The forensics team, as usual, were unfazed and were simply taking notes, but the officers on the other side of the room were mostly shocked. Hassan suddenly clenched the table with his left fist and gasped sharply. Charlie wiped his eyes and focused on the image. The 2 bodies in a police uniform were slumped over next to a dumpster. Both of their necks were limp, and the body on the left had a half of its torso missing, while the other wore a look of absolute terror. There was a lot of blood. Dr. North surveyed the musing officers before settling her eyes on Hassan. "Sergeant, do you need to take a minute outside?" she asked. Hassan nodded and staggered outside. Charlie raised his hand. "Yes, Detective?" North asked sternly. "Any information on Miss Rosenthal?" he asked. North flicked through some notes on the stand. She picked out a file. "CCTV footage showed her entering the alleyway where the attack took place. The officers follow her in, and she comes out about 10 minutes later. The officers had no money on them when backup arrived. Piper re-entered the train station, and she boarded a train. It's currently unknown where the train is headed." North folded the document up. She looked at Charlie. "Miller told me about you," she frowned. "Weren't you the one that wanted this authorized?" Charlie stared at his feet. He could feel the room looking at him. Hassan walked back into the room, his eyes darting around. He took a seat and nodded to North. "If, as a result of Piper boarding the train, means she's heading to London, I want a vigil to be made at Paddington, St. Pancras and Euston. I think I can speak for all of the Met here. I don't want her slipping through again." North flared at Charlie. "And, Detective Lancaster, I don't want any mistakes this time." North picked up her documents and the lights were turned back on. "Dismissed." Charlie looked over at Hassan. "Why did you have her leave, Oliver?" he asked. Hassan turned around. "September 15th. I was the one who took the photo. I was the one who saw the carnage. If it's a similar incident, then it gives me flashbacks," Hassan replied. Charlie nodded. "I need the boys at the stations notified," and Hassan stood up. "May as well start now. If she's boarded another train, she may very well be there now." Charlie's eyes widened. "Shit," he exclaimed. He grabbed his coat and stood up. "Come on." Hassan looked dazed. He walked out of the room, unenthusiastically. And there she was, nearly there. Danny wasn't too far away, was he? Had she even planned on what to do when she found him? No, she'd probably kill him. The train was pulling into the station. It wasn't anything too prestigious, only standard class. Where was this station? London? Euston? Yes, it was Euston Station. She'd been there before, as a child, before she went to Oxford. She'd been to London Euston. It was a nice station, very modern. She may as well take it in. The train was stopping now. She was standing up, walking through the aisle and exiting the train. Many strange looks, lots of stares. That was it. She was plastered all over the news, and now everyone was looking at her. Before the joy of transformation had overtaken her, she may have intoxicated herself with alcohol and relished in the popularity. But now it was somewhat strange. Wait, why were there so many police officers at the ticket gates? There weren't supposed to be this many. She gripped at a wrist that was aching to pick at her teeth. The last thing she wanted to show in her mouth was blood. The officers were looking at her. They were approaching her, and they were calling her name. "Miss Rosenthal!" They were arresting her again. No! The hand that was approaching her arm was grabbed. She twisted it around and heard a crack echo across the platform. A scream, and various other officers were approaching her. People were running, screaming. She needed to run. She couldn't approach this. She needed to find Danny. And so she barged past the first wave of officers, and people were now running in all directions. She could now blend in. Wait, why was she dizzy? Why was she tripping? Had she slipped on something? She was falling to the ground, and thud. She was breathing heavily. She was aware of multiple bodies around her, and her hands being pulled behind her back. Who are you? Speech escaped her lips. Why was she speaking? She was being picked up, escorted outside, into a fluorescent car. Police? She was bundled in and the door closed. It was here that she felt very tired. Maybe she'd been concussed as she hit the ground. She keeled over onto the back seat as the engine started up, and she was so very sleepy. Charlie was, to say at least, very pleased to himself. Piper had been detained. She was in West Hampstead with Danny, but she hadn't met him yet. She'd probably been taken to a temporary prison before the trial. Charlie was escorted past an interrogation room and into the booth behind the two-way mirror. He was there with both Dr. North and Ollie. A tall woman with a steely gaze stepped into the room, carrying a small file. She sat down on one end of the table, located under a bright light. "Oliver has told me about Piper, and has met her family, and that's why he's here. Before you ask," North looked over at Charlie. "Hello, Charlie," Hassan said friendly. It was at this point when the door opened and a stocky, tall gentleman with thick uniform and a stab vest entered the room, followed by a tall yet thin girl with a pale skin and long black hair. She tottered in and sat down at the table. The gentleman closed the door and stood across it with his massive bulk. Piper looked around the room nonchalantly. She was wearing a khaki jumpsuit, different to the tracksuit she'd been found in. "Hello, Miss Rosenthal," the woman on the other side of the table said. "I am Amelia Naismith, part of the support team in the Met." She held an optimistic stance, and North scoffed. "She's so optimistic that you eventually give in to her," she mused. Piper stared at her. She curled her head slightly. "Hello." Her voice was smooth. Charlie removed his coat and rolled his shirt sleeves up. He placed his fists onto the desk and looked in. "Do you have anything on her mental state?" He looked at North. North shook her head. Charlie looked back at the interrogation. "I'm sure you want to know why you're in here?" Naismith asked. Piper shrugged. "Where's Danny?" she asked. Naismith glared at her. "Danny is in his cell, and we thought that he killed you, but we're obviously wrong." she smiled. Piper exhaled. "Ah, I feel dead. I wish he did." She looked sad. "Well, I just want to ask you some questions. Is that all right?" Naismith looked touched by Piper's response. North rolled her eyes. "So, we'll start with the easy questions for now. What is your name?" Naismith looked at Piper, and Piper looked into space for a moment. "My name's Piper Elizabeth Rosenthal. I'm 20 years old." Naismith wrote the answer down on an A4 notebook. "Okay, thank you. Now, how do you know Daniel Adams?" she asked slowly. Piper looked confused. "He was a boy in the university with me, but that's all." Naismith also wrote this down. "Thanks for that. Next question. What happened to you on September the 15th, the last full moon?" she asked, hopefully. Charlie leaned forward, so close that his nose was almost touching the glass. "The joy of transformation." Piper gave a sickly grin. Naismith exhaled before writing this down. "What is the joy of transformation?" she questioned. Piper looked at her like she was the stupidest person on earth. "It is when I can be free of myself from the constraints of this body, where I can metamorphose into the perfect creature." Piper's grin widened. Her eyes looked hungrily at Naismith, and Charlie looked round at Hassan. "Get Adams in here. If anyone asks, say I've authorized it." He spoke up. Naismith pursed her lips and wrote down the answer. "And what is this perfect creature?" she asked. Piper blinked slowly, her long eyelashes partially covered by her hair. "I become what all humans should be. I become what humans are fearful of. I become a combination of beauty." Piper patted her clothed breasts. "And horror." She opened her mouth and picked some dry blood from her teeth. Naismith looked pale. Her hands were shaking as she wrote down Piper's answers. It was at this point in which Hassan returned with a handcuffed Danny. North eyed him up and down. "Well, he suddenly looks like a criminal," she mused. "It's okay. You can uncuff him," Charlie said with a hint of compassion in his voice. Hassan nodded and did as he was asked. Charlie beckoned the now free Danny over. He pointed at Piper through the glass. "Is this common with the lost?" he asked. Danny looked at him. His green eyes looked far more dull than when he graduated. "Pretty much," he said. Charlie looked at Naismith. "She looks out of her depth here, Ingrid," he stated. North looked at him, then at Danny. "Send him in." She shot Naismith a glare through the mirror, and Danny sighed. "Jesus," he muttered as Hassan escorted him out of the room. Charlie opened a microphone to make contact with the room. "Amelia Naismith, you are dismissed." He spoke with zero emotion running through his voice. Naismith looked up at a speaker and gathered her things. The guard stepped aside as she left the room. "Piper Rosenthal, you are now going to meet Daniel Adams," he continued. Piper's ears pricked. She looked over to the two-way mirror and winked. Danny entered the room and the guard stepped back across the door. "Hello, Piper." Danny greeted the autonomous girl. Piper rolled her eyes. "Did you have to kill that couple?" he asked. Piper glared at him. "No, but no one said I couldn't," she smiled. Danny just scowled. "I didn't kill them either. I just dismembered them, and then I left." She leaned back against a chair, and Danny made a face. "What are you going to do with me?" he questioned. "I'm going to dismember you as well," she replied, coolly. Danny shrugged. "Go ahead." Charlie chuckled to himself. It wasn't a very good plan, what Danny was going to do. Piper grinned and stood up. The guard perked up. "I could fucking kill you now," she shouted at Danny. She kicked a chair away. "Just fucking watch me." She threw the table aside and lunged at Danny. The guard at this point had righted himself and was on his way to break up the fight. Charlie gasped. North stared at him. "She's got a few screws loose, I'll give you that." The guard dragged Piper off of Danny before she could do anything, and Hassan stormed in. "Get her back to her cell," he yelled as he helped Danny up and pulled him out of the room. Charlie looked over at North as Piper was restrained and taken back to her cell. "Shit," she muttered. Charlie looked over the overturned chairs. "I suppose we should save this for the trial," he asked. North angrily looked at him. "What's your case for Adams now?" Charlie exhaled. I'll ask the Old Bailey to drop it. Maybe they can replace him with Piper." North blinked. Just do them both, she retorted. Charlie nodded. Very well. Ludmilla Cataline heard her family dog reach the letterbox before she had a chance to get there. A medium-sized envelope lay on the welcome mat. It was addressed to her. She opened it in the hallway. Dear Miss Ludmilla Cataline, I understand that you were a witness to the acts of Daniel Adams during August, as well as the change in Miss Piper Rosenthal's behaviour during this period. This letter is a request for you to provide evidence at the trial of Daniel Adams at the Old Bailey in London on the 15th of November 2019. If you are unable to make this date, please send your regards at least 2 weeks ahead. Contained in this note is a return flight to London Heathrow, as well as a pass to access a private suite at the Langham Hotel with an indefinite booking, meaning you can stay as long as you wish. I do hope you can make it to the case, as whatever you could say could determine the course of justice. Yours sincerely, D.I. Charlie Lancaster. Ludmilla huffed. She had been back in Vilnius for a mere 2 months, and now she was being shipped back out to London. She may as well go. Piper was her best friend after all. Ludmilla rolled her eyes before walking upstairs and packing her bag. By the time the 15th rolled around, any attempt of interviewing or questioning Piper had become impossible. North was clear that her judgment would be innocent by reason of insanity, and argued that, with many higher-ups, that it was important that she should get the care she needed. Ludmilla arrived in London and spent many hours discussing and documenting her testimonies of the ordeals. Piper's family was also informed about all of the news, and they quickly made their way down to London. Danny spent day after day in meditation, waiting for the trial. Charlie waited for his opportunity to state his case. Whatever the verdict was, he needed to study this werewolf condition further. It was the 14th. Piper was a day away from her trial for 5 murders and injuring a police officer. Her mind was swimming with hundreds of emotions. Was she meant to feel excited, or nervous, or sad? She didn't know. Piper was lying on her bed in the jail beneath the courthouse. She didn't want to get up. She just wanted to stay here for the rest of time. Her body felt heavy, and she was tired, and she felt sick. She wanted to die. There was a heavy knock at the door, and Piper opened her heavy eyelids. The door at the corner of her cell was opened, and Charlie walked in. Piper sat up and blinked. I don't want to be interviewed by anybody. Charlie stood in the middle of the room. It's all the new systems are asking for these days. She had grown to recognize Charlie. He wasn't a threat. Given that this might be your last night as a free woman, I have been given permission for you to leave your cell. There'll be guards everywhere, but it's the best I can do. He offered a thin smile, and Piper exhaled, before smiling. My mind appears to have become clearer. You are a good man, Detective Lancaster. Charlie rolled his eyes. He wasn't easily flattered. I asked ahead for some of your clothes from your home to be brought here. Charlie looked over to the door, where Hassan walked in and gave him a package. Charlie walked towards Piper and handed her the small box. I'll leave you here while you get changed. He turned his back and left the room. Despite his outward and kind actions, Charlie had quite a nefarious plan. His obsession with learning about the werewolf affliction had driven him to extreme lengths, and he had found a brutal solution. There was an expectation that a full moon would be in the sky over the next few days, and Charlie wanted to lure Piper into the city. Armed police would no doubt be summoned, and they would probably shoot the transformed Piper dead, at which point Charlie could have her body examined and further identify various parts of the affliction. He knew it was inhuman, but so was Jenna's smallpox vaccine and Pasteur's chicken cholera cure. Charlie breathed deeply after Piper left the room, dressed in some of her nicest clothes. A pair of black skinny jeans, a light pink vest, and a crop blue denim jacket, and she was wearing a pair of dark green Vans as well. Charlie couldn't help but bite his lip, and Piper had been held in custody for months, and she was clearly excited for this occasion, and Charlie was going to ruin it by having her go through pure agony. He assumed that, after countless psychiatric teams giving her therapy and mind hypnosis, her sadism and insanity may have retracted slightly. Charlie shrugged and picked up his coat, and Piper followed him out of the basement. Though no actual plan had been set up, Charlie wanted Piper to direct the evening. And she was like a child, encouraging the detective to go everywhere. It was only 5 p.m, but the sun was beginning to set, and Charlie smirked. "We might as well go get a coffee," he spoke up. Piper turned around and looked at him. "Given that we can be out longer that way." Piper nodded and followed him to a pret-a-manger not too far away from where they were standing. It wasn't too busy, and Charlie intentionally chose a seat close to the window. Charlie looked up and spotted the moon. He smiled. Piper looked at him strangely before meeting his gaze. She blinked and then grinned. She pushed the table forward and braced herself. If she had been enthusiastic about the transformation before it began, one could not say the same thing now. Piper screamed through gritted teeth and stood up. The entire cafe looked over to her. Piper began shaking and put her hands to her face and clenched her teeth in agony as her nails floated off her fingers, leaving new claws growing from the bloody places. The same was happening to her feet as her hands began to convulse and grow. It had been months since Piper had turned, and she had long lost the ability to fight the changes. Piper screamed as her hands started to deform and curve, and she fell over as her feet stretched and then tore through her shoes and contorted. Her palms and soles began developing leathery pads, and black fur began sprouting from them. Piper whimpered and tried to stand up again, but to do so was so impossible. She had lost the ability to stand, unless in her feral state, and slipped straight over. Charlie intently watched the transformation unfold as people began backing away and picking up their things to leave. A man came up behind Charlie. "Is she all right, mate?" he asked. Charlie looked at him, a look of giddy excitement on his face. "I don't think so," he replied. The man edged away. Piper screamed again loudly in agony, so much it sent a chill through the almost automation state of Charlie as a towel grew from her spine, shredding through the seams of her jeans, and grew gradually longer to around 1.5 feet. Piper's violet eyes began to well up with tears as her bottom began expanding, and she looked shocked more than anything else, like she forgot how much pain she'd be in because of this. She didn't speak, only looked around in pain. Her eyes said everything. She wanted help, but didn't think anyone could give her any. Piper's legs and towel began growing black fur, and by this point she looked like an absolute wreck. Her eyes were sinking into their sockets, almost as if the transformation was killing her energy reserves.
"Detective, why? What?"
Piper seemed to have discovered what was going on. It seemed that the agony of not turning for nearly 3 months and the work of psychiatrists had done with her had killed any shred of insanity during transformation. And by this point, people were leaving at quite a steady rate. People knew what Piper was, but they didn't want to admit it. Her leg muscles grew and moved around as her bottom half became completely transformed, completely ripping off her jeans. She forced herself out of the chair and up against the wall. Her breasts began expanding, doubling in size, ripping off her vest. "So, your transformation favours you." Charlie crossed her legs.
It just happens."
Piper choked as deafening cracks forced her skeleton to begin growing, as her body gradually changed shape. Her shoulders broadened, leaving her feminine build lost in a buff frame and straining her jacket. Tears began to form in the fabric, and Piper crunched her shoulders, causing the jacket to break into 2 pieces. Piper ripped off the remaining fabric and held half of it up to her eyes as she began sobbing loudly. Fur started growing in all kinds of places as a deafening crack was heard and her chest sagged. Piper gasped sharply.
My ribs!"
She moaned. Her chest began to stretch and pulled out, and before it straightened out, she collapsed onto her soft bosom and rolled onto her back as her digestive system changed. Piper stroked her abdomen before groaning again in pain as blood began to appear from between her legs. Charlie grimaced.
"It's not meant to go this way, detective. My tits didn't grow until the blood had flowed."
Piper groaned weakly. Fur began growing all the way up her body, reaching her chest and arms.
"Detective, get me out of here, please."
Piper was cut off as the room her new ribs had given her was being filled up. Her lungs expanded and tore through her bronchi, which now began to rebuild itself. She coughed up bloody phlegm, and Piper's torso and arms were now engulfed in fur, and she was transforming further. Her arms lengthened and grew tense, engorged muscles. The same happened with her body. Her abs were growing, forming visibly tough muscle. Now, all that was left was her neck and head, which had become covered in fur. Piper's tears began falling at an even greater rate as the sheer terror she was experiencing racked up from 1 to 10 in seconds. And she was turning in the middle of London.
Why? What have I done to deserve this pain? It's not meant to feel this way.
Piper cried. Her ears suddenly felt like fire as they began to curve and stretch. They moved further up her head. Piper felt her teeth vibrating and they started to feel very cold. She could feel something below them and watched the first of many fall from her mouth. She clutched her silky hair and cried harder. Why was she here? Fangs began throwing her teeth out from her mouth, sharp enough to shred anything to pieces. Her new teeth finished moving into place.
Detective, run!
Piper screamed as her new voice degenerated into an unintelligible scream. Her face pushed forward and formed a muzzle, and it was immobilized by black fur along with her now black wet nose. Piper forced her eyes shut for a moment, covering her face in her hands and backing her huge frame away from Charlie before her body clicked. Piper lowered her hands, and before standing up a full 7 feet tall, her eyes were now bright yellow and all sense of humanity gone. Charlie didn't run. He wanted to observe this beast. He anticipated that, given her bulk, she wouldn't be able to make it up the narrow staircase. He kept his eyes on her as he backed away. His foot hit the stair and he tripped. The werewolf saw this as an opportunity to strike. Charlie kicked off both his shoes and bolted up the stairs, and he heard Piper try to make it up, but she was simply too big. Charlie heard Piper leave the cafe where a large commotion had formed. He didn't need to see what was happening out there. Hundreds of bystanders had just seen what happened, and who knows how many videos, and now they weren't running. Maybe they saw this as a big project by some film company, and a small applause scattered across the crowd. This applause turned to confusion, and then to horror, as a piercing scream cut into the night. Then more screams and stamping of feet and running. Charlie heard an inhuman growl before another scream, which was shortly cut off. He saw an arm fly across from the cafe, and then another crunch of bones before another quieter growl of happiness filled his ears. Whatever had become of Piper stepped fully into the night. She let out an eerie howl into the sky and bolted towards the screaming, fleeing crowd. Charlie dropped his head into his hands and began to cry. What had he just done? Wow. Absolutely chest-pounding, wonderfully written stuff there. Thank you so much, brother. WolfInSpace, the author. Absolutely awesome writer. Really enjoying this series. Guys and girls, as ever, please do let us know down below in the comments what you thought. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And of course, don't forget to hashtag Team Fear. Part 4 is on its way shortly, so stay tuned for that. I'll update you guys as soon as possible on that one. And of course, I hope you guys are enjoying your weekends with friends and family and lots of good food. But above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.